May 4, 1945. The Tangermünde Bridge over the Elbe was wrecked, its steel skeleton twisting and creaking under the push of thousands. German troops picked their way across the mangled span that had once been a modern crossing. Demolished by retreating Wehrmacht engineers on April 12th, it had become a fragile lifeline, just a narrow path of shattered concrete and bent girders over the river's bend. American signals units picked up the traffic. 102nd Infantry Division sector. Wehrmacht formations were abandoning everything. A mass shift was underway toward U.S. lines. Roughly 100,000 soldiers and civilians were trying to move west through ruined roads and broken bridges. Captain William Patterson of the 405th Infantry lowered his field glasses and studied the never-ending stream of people inching over the broken span. American forces had reached the Elbe 2 weeks earlier, stopping where the Yalta Agreement said they should. No one on the Allied staff had guessed this damaged crossing would turn into the center of the largest voluntary military surrender in the West. The drive-pushing German columns wasn't strategy, it was math. The odds of dying in Soviet captivity looked far higher than the odds of surviving with the Americans. Reports poured into Kiev with the same story. German units were not just falling back. They were leaving defensive lines, blowing up gear that slowed them, and forcing their way past SS blocking detachments. The Wehrmacht, the disciplined machine that once overran Europe, was dissolving into a human tide with a single goal: reach the American side of the Elbe. By late April 1945, the survival equation was obvious. German intelligence had intercepted Soviet traffic predicting fatality rates for POWs. Out of every 100 Germans taken by the Red Army, projections suggested fewer than 40 would ever come home. Reality would be worse. The military position was past saving. Some 8 million civilians fled west from East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania. Behind them, Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front crushed the last German defenses with sheer weight. 20 Soviet divisions faced each combat-effective German division. Soviet spearheads advanced about 30 kilometers a day. Refugee columns made 10 on good days. The end was certain. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's final assessment, seized after the surrender, carried one underlined order: get as many Germans as possible to Western Allied lines before the Soviets closed the ring. It wasn't despair. It was a hard truth. Giving up to Americans meant a chance to live. Falling to the Soviets often didn't. Yalta had already set occupation zones, but German commanders bet on one fact: American troops had halted at the Elbe as agreed. If German units crossed before the Soviets arrived, they would be in U.S. custody. The race was not for victory or terms. It was for the basic chance to survive captivity. On the West Bank, American logistics would decide whether that was possible. Each U.S. infantry division had military police battalions, field kitchens that could feed 15,000 per day, mobile surgical teams, and deep supply dumps backed by American industry. Major James Morrison, G3 of the 102nd Infantry Division, had studied mass surrender handling after the Ruhr Pocket in mid-April, when 325,000 Germans laid down arms. His numbers were grim. To support 1,000 prisoners per day took 3 tons of food, 5,000 gallons of water, typhus and dysentery screening, delousing lines, and paperwork totaling 12 forms per person. Geneva rules set calories: about 2,800 for working POWs, 2,000 for non-working. These were not abstractions. They were the thin line between order and collapse when confronted by desperate crowds. The Germans pushing for the Elbe showed the full picture of a dissolving Wehrmacht. Some Waffen-SS elements still had Tigers and solid comms. Regular divisions were down to battalion size with only small arms. Volkssturm, boys barely 14 and men past 60, had armbands and World War I rifles. Behind them marched organization-taught labor units, Luftwaffe ground crews with no planes, Kriegsmarine personnel from ruined ports, and female auxiliaries who feared Soviet capture most. Analysts estimated about 1.2 million German personnel still east of the Elbe on April 25, 1945. Roughly 300,000 organized combat troops, 400,000 support, and 500,000 scattered Wehrmacht and Volkssturm already fleeing. Movement speed decided everything. Soviet armor could cover 50 kilometers a day, foot columns maybe 30 at best. The escape window was measured in hours. The key signal came April 20th, 1945, when General Walther Wenck received Hitler's order to attack toward Berlin with 12th Army. Wenck chose differently and saved hundreds of thousands. He would not hurl his army into the dying ring around Berlin. He would hold open a corridor westward to the Americans. At headquarters near Belzig, he told his officers, "The war is lost. Our duty now is to the living, our soldiers and the civilians with them. We attack west to make a path to the Americans." It was not cowardice. It was clear-eyed humanity. Wenck's intelligence chief, Colonel Günther Reichhelm, had compiled devastating figures from Soviet-occupied areas. In East Prussia alone, some 300,000 civilians had died from combat, exposure, reprisals, and mass rape. Applied to the population now trapped between the Elbe and the Red Army, the losses could reach into the millions. By April 24th, forward American OPs reported astonishing scenes. German vehicles rolled to the Elbe without dispersion, headlights on, ignoring basic fieldcraft. Units arrived in parade order. Officers kept their bearing even in defeat. This wasn't a routed mob. It was organized surrender, chosen over pointless fighting. Captain Robert Thornton, Recon Company commander in 2nd Armored Division, radioed, "German forces approaching are not attacking. They're under white flags, asking terms." Hours later, the trickle became a torrent. 9th U.S. Army counted 3,000 voluntary surrenders on April 24th, 7,000 on the 25th, 15,000 on the 26th. These were not battlefield captures. These were units with ammo and cohesion walking in by choice. The Ruhr Pocket had set the pattern. When Field Marshal Walter Model dissolved Army Group B rather than sign terms, 325,000 German troops gave themselves up to U.S. forces. Word of their treatment, food, medical care, protection from revenge attacks raced through German channels. American SIGINT logged extraordinary traffic. On April 27th, the commander of the 3rd Panzer Corps transmitted, "Americans applying Geneva Convention at all collection points, medical treatment provided, food distribution confirmed." Food mattered most. German ration scales had collapsed. The effect on morale was immediate. After 6 years of ferocious war, men thought only of reaching U.S. lines. Sergeant Wilhelm Becker of 21st Panzer later said, "We'd heard the Americans fed prisoners and treated the wounded. After total war, that sounded unreal. But we ran toward it." Getting there meant running a gauntlet. SS blocking troops had orders to execute anyone retreating without permission. Field police set up checkpoints on westbound roads, turning back or shooting defeatists. Fanatical SS units held to the end, calling surrender betrayal. The Battle of Halbe, April 24th, May 1st, showed the price of the westward flight. General Theodor Busse's Ninth Army, about 200,000 soldiers and 40,000 civilians, was trapped southeast of Berlin. Hitler ordered them to break into Berlin. Busse coordinated with Wenck instead, aiming west. The breakout began 2,000 hours, April 25th. The 11th SS Panzer Corps used its last fuel to punch a hole near Halbe. Behind it came a bizarre procession. Combat troops, medics, clerks, refugees, dependents, even bands with their instruments. The column stretched 30 kilometers through the Spreewald. It was a living snake through swamp and forest. Soviet fire raked it. Katyusha salvos tore into dense masses. Il-2s strafed everything that moved. T-34s rolled over strong points, and the men in them. The woods became a killing ground. Bodies piled up at streams covered by machine guns. Those too badly hurt to keep up were left where they fell. Colonel Hans von Luck, with remnants of a panzer regiment, called it what it was, not war, but slaughter. Artillery turned forest paths into death lanes. If we stopped, we died. I saw officers shoot their own wounded to spare them capture. The losses were stunning. Of the 200,000 who started, about 40,000 reached Wenck's lines and then American captivity. The Halbe Cemetery holds roughly 24,000 graves, most marked unknown German soldier. Another 60,000 were captured by the Soviets. Few survived captivity. The rest vanished, killed in clashes, drowned at crossings, or lost in the woods. Wenck's 12th Army undertook one of the war's most remarkable humanitarian missions. Ignoring Hitler's Berlin order, Wenck set a 40-kilometer corridor from the Elbe to the scattered German remnants. His 100,000 troops, including the elite Clausewitz and Scharnhorst divisions, held off Soviet pushes while refugees flowed through. He put his HQ in a schoolhouse near Fürstenberg, turning it into an evac center. His staff worked non-stop, moving the wounded, giving the last army rations to civilians, and keeping radio contact with German fragments still battling west. Lieutenant Hans Maymann in operations wrote, "We estimate 500,000 civilians in our sector, plus remnants of 20 units. No food for civilians, medical supplies gone, ammo for maybe 48 hours. Yet we must hold until all who can be saved reach the Americans." Wenck toured the line, urging exhausted men, teen trainees and elderly Volkssturm alike, to hang on a little longer. He could have run, one soldier recalled. Senior officers were vanishing west in staff cars. Wenck stayed. Because he stayed, we stayed. His defense used islands of strength. He didn't try to hold an unbroken front. He fortified key road hubs and bridges, forcing the Soviets to set up full assaults instead of easy pursuit. It bought time for the columns at terrible cost for the outposts. The ruined Tangermünde bridge became the pivot. Wehrmacht engineers had blown the modern span on April 12th to slow Americans, but its wreckage was now the only crossing for 50 kilometers. German and U.S. engineers from opposite banks braced the shell of the bridge into a single-file path. Scenes at the crossing broke every rule book. From May 4th to May 7th, maybe 100,000 people picked their way across. Wehrmacht colonels directed traffic with American sergeants. German MPs kept order on the east side. U.S. MPs controlled the west. Everyone knew chaos would kill. If the crossing jammed, the Soviets would trap thousands. Lieutenant Colonel William Davis of the 102nd called the cooperation surreal. German officers saluted. We saluted back. Their engineers asked for gear to strengthen the bridge. We handed it over. Everyone knew Lives depended on keeping it open. The flow never stopped, and it broke your heart. A German colonel appeared with his full regimental staff to surrender the unit flag with ceremony. An SS general arrived in dress uniform, asking honorable treatment for his men. A naval captain led 200 mariners who hadn't seen the sea in months, pressed into infantry work. Female auxiliaries, some only 17, begged not to be sent back east. Civilians were the hardest sight of all. Families pushed their lives in baby carriages. Children separated from parents were passed hand to hand. The elderly were carried by strangers. Hospital patients, some still in beds, were wheeled across by staff who refused to leave them. Master Sergeant James Patterson, running the West Approach, later wrote, "They came in waves, dawn to dusk, then through the night. Soldiers stacked rifles like cordwood, women with infants, school-age boys in Wehrmacht tunics, old men with Volkssturm armbands. No one ran, no one fought. They were just grateful to reach our side." The numbers broke U.S. admin systems. Geneva rules required IDs, medical screening, food, and shelter. Properly processing one prisoner took 20 minutes. At the peak, 20,000 arrived per day. The system buckled. Colonel Benjamin Thompson, Chief of Staff, Exultate Airborne Corps, made the call. Forget the paperwork. Feed them, delouse them, treat the wounded. The forms can wait. Levs can't. It saved thousands and created years of admin mess. Families got split and never found one another. Men lost their units. Casualty counts were impossible. Some war criminals likely slipped away, but the alternative, turning people back, was unthinkable. The medical crisis was stark. Army doctors estimated 30% needed immediate care. Months of starvation were obvious. Lice spread typhus. Untreated wounds had gone gangrenous. Surgical teams made for dozens handled hundreds. Captain David Miller of the 330th Medical Battalion worked 72 hours straight. "These weren't fresh wounds," he said. "They were weeks old, infected filthy. Men walking on broken bones, women with injuries from assault. Children so malnourished they couldn't stand. Even U.S. supplies strained. A division carried food for 15,000 men for a week. By May 5th, they fed 60,000 prisoners plus civilians. Convoys ran nonstop. C-47s dropped supply bundles. The Red Ball Express, Patton's old lifeline, spooled up again to feed former enemies. But at Schaeff, General Eisenhower faced a hard choice. Yalta said German forces had to surrender to all allies together. Accepting separate surrenders in the West while they still fought the Soviets broke the spirit of Allied unity. But the humanitarian disaster was real. On May 4th, Admiral Karl Dönitz sent Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg to Field Marshal Montgomery. The offer was blunt: immediate surrender of all forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and Holland to the Western Allies, so people could flee the Soviets. Montgomery, bound to unconditional surrender to all allies, could not pick and choose. But he grasped the human reality. He later wrote that Germans were not just laying down arms, they were seeking rescue from Soviet vengeance. Soldiers could offer honorable captivity. What the Soviets offered, no one could say. The stopgap was practical. Germans reaching U.S. lines before the general surrender on May 8th would be processed as POWs. Those arriving after would fall under Soviet repatriation terms. It set a deadly deadline: cross before midnight on May 8th or face Soviet custody. General Omar Bradley later admitted, We knew we were accepting surrenders we technically shouldn't from forces still fighting our ally. But we also knew what Soviet captivity meant. Sometimes humanity outranks protocol. From May 4th to May 8th, urgency took over. With capitulation near, German units dropped all pretense of order. Weapons and gear were dumped to move faster. Officers burned files. Whole divisions dissolved as men made their own choice to run west. The Tangermünde crossing ran nonstop. Even when Soviet guns came into range on May 6th, the human stream kept moving. American artillery provided counter-battery fire, firing at Soviets to shield Germans who were surrendering. It was one of the war's oddest scenes. Americans and Germans cooperating while officially still enemies. At 0241 on May 7th, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims. The ceasefire would start 2301 on May 8th. That left roughly 45 hours to reach U.S. lines. The greatest race against a clock in military history began. This wasn't a standard retreat or formal surrender. It was a migration under arms. Estimates said 250,000 German military personnel were still east of the Elbe on May 7th. In 45 hours, about 180,000 reached the Americans. The rest fell into Soviet hands. With grim outcomes, Wenck's last operation showed honor in defeat. His 12th Army held the corridor to the last possible moment, letting fragments of 9th Army and hundreds of thousands of civilians pass. He positioned his last tanks and guns to hold off the Red Army while the stream continued. At 1800 on May 7th, he issued his final order. The 12th Army has done its last duty. We saved all we could. Commanders are released to seek safety for their men. It was not surrender. It was permission for his soldiers to decide. Wenck himself crossed at 0200 on May 8th over a wrecked rail bridge near Tangermünde less than 21 hours before the ceasefire. Behind him, Soviet armor was already rolling into the positions his troops had left. Of his original 200,000, roughly half reached American lines. About 250,000 civilians were saved because he defied Hitler. Individual stories showed the desperation. Luftwaffe Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann flew his Bf 109 west until dry tanks forced a crash landing in U.S. territory, safer than drifting into Soviet lines. U-boat commander Heinrich Lyman von Be took his submarine up the Elbe as far as he could, scuttled her, and led his crew overland to the Americans. A Wehrmacht doctor stayed with the gravely wounded who could not be moved, knowing he would face Soviet captivity. Someone must care for those who cannot flee. A teenage soldier gave his truck spot to an elderly civilian and walked the last 100 kilometers. He arrived 18 hours after the ceasefire, technically too late, but was taken in by sympathetic U.S. guards. The Rheinwiesenlager meadow camps became collection points. Barbed wire fields held over 1 million prisoners by May 15th. Conditions were harsh, but survivable. The key difference from the East. At first, there were no shelters beyond dugouts. Rations started around 1,200 calories, rising as supply improved. Water came from rivers and temporary pipes. Sanitation was basic. Disease spread in the crowding. Even so, the death rate stayed under 1% versus 35% or more in Soviet hands. Colonel James Foster at Remagen faced chaos. Built for $100,000, his site held $184,000 by May 12th. SS generals beside communist prisoners, Hitler Youth next to Stalingrad veterans, female auxiliaries needing separate space, sailors who'd never fought on land. It was controlled chaos, but we kept order and kept them alive. Processing showed the Wehrmacht's collapse. Some units still had full paperwork. Others had nothing but names men could remember. The once feared 16th Panzer mustered 312 men from an authorized 14,000. The 246th Volksgrenadier Division counted 89 elderly soldiers, categories blurred. Were Hitler Youth soldiers or children? Were female auxiliaries military or civilian? Were Volkssturm combatants or conscripts? U.S. authorities leaned toward humanitarian answers, treating all as POWs under Geneva protection. What Germans were fleeing became clearer as Soviet records surfaced after 1991. NKVD documents confirmed the fear had been justified. Of roughly 3 million Germans captured by the USSR, at least 1.1 million died. In 1945-46, some camps saw death rates above 50%. Supplies were short even for the Red Army, let alone millions of POWs. German prisoners got 600, 800 calories a day, far below survival levels for forced labor. Medical care was minimal. Typhus, dysentery, and TB ran unchecked. Siberian winters hit 40 degrees Celsius without proper clothing or shelter. On top of deprivation came cruelty. Many Soviet guards, carrying personal grief from German atrocities, showed no mercy. Prisoners worked uranium mines without protection, logging camps with impossible quotas, and construction sites where safety didn't exist. The sick and wounded, often shot as useless mouths. Former Soviet officer Viktor Astafiev later wrote, "We were told every dead German was payment for our suffering. Leningrad, Stalingrad, the 27 million dead. Guards competed in grinding prisoners to death. Mercy meant betraying our own." The math spoke for itself. Western records show that of 3.8 million German POWs in U.S., British, and French custody, about 137,000 died, roughly 3.6%, mostly from prior wounds or disease during the chaotic end. By June 1945, U.S. camp deaths had fallen to about 0.15% per month. Soviet numbers, even official ones, showed disaster. Moscow listed 350 to 700 German POW deaths, while German researchers put it over 1 million. The Mashka Commission found that fewer than half of those taken in 1945 were alive in 1950. Some groups fared worse. Waffen-SS survival in Soviet hands was around 20% versus 95% in the West. Female auxiliaries suffered systemic assault in Soviet captivity. Americans generally released them within months. Hitler Youth prisoners were often executed as fanatics by Soviet units. Americans processed them as juveniles to be rehabilitated. The mass flight to U.S. lines reshaped post-war Europe. The Western Allies held most of the surviving German military, gaining intelligence as the Cold War began. Operation Paperclip thrived because technical experts surrendered west. Werner von Braun's rocket team moved 500 kilometers through collapsing lines to reach Americans. We despise the French, fear the Soviets, doubt the British can afford us. That leaves the Americans, von Braun told colleagues. The choice would help send men to the moon. The demographic toll was immense. East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania lost nearly all military-age men, killed, fled west, or taken by the Soviets. Entire family lines ended. The GDR struggled for decades with the gender gap left by missing men. The psychological mark lasted generations. Families split by the inner German border often traced it to those May days, some reaching U.S. lines, others trapped in Soviet zones. Survival often came down to which army took you, and that became a national trauma. By 2301, on May 8, 1945, when the shooting finally stopped, American forces had processed roughly 1.5 million German military prisoners in the last 3 weeks. The 102nd Infantry Division alone took $313,000, more than the entire German force that invaded Poland in 1939. The total stunned observers. 9th Army reported 423,000 POWs from April 20th to May 8th. 1st Army processed 387,000. Fewer than 20,000 were captured in combat. The rest surrendered on purpose, sometimes fighting through their own lines to do it. General Omar Bradley later wrote, "We prepared for victory, not for this." The German army didn't just surrender, it dissolved. Men who fought like demons for 6 years cared only about reaching our lines. They already knew what we learned later. Surrendering to us meant life. Falling to the Soviets often meant death. And the stream didn't stop on May 8th. Between May 8th and 31st, another 874,000 German personnel reached Western lines from Soviet areas by escape, clerical fog, or lenient reading of deadlines by U.S. and British guards. Individual accounts put faces to the numbers. Corporal Friedrich Müller, who surrendered at Tangermünde on May 5th, kept a diary. "First day without fear in 6 years. Americans gave us bread, real bread. A guard offered a cigarette. I cried, after what we did, why treat us as human?" Nurse Hildegard Schneider crossed the Elbe with a hospital unit. "We had 300 wounded. The Americans took them all, even SS. Their surgeons worked all night. One told me, 'The war's over. Now you're patients and we're doctors.' I didn't know such mercy existed." Wehrmacht, Private Hans Bauer, 17. "They told us Americans tortured prisoners, that surrender was shame. Instead, they gave me chocolate. A medic cleaned my infected leg. An officer asked if I wanted to write my mother. They treated me like a boy forced to fight." Former SS officer Wilhelm Hartung, expecting a bullet, received treatment and eventual release. "I deserved no mercy, yet the Americans followed the law, not revenge. That mercy weighed on me more than any punishment." General Walther Wenck lived until 1982. In a 1975 interview, he said, "I disobeyed Hitler, and I would again. My duty was to living men. Every soldier across the Elbe was a victory. Every saved civilian a triumph. We lost the war, but in those days, we saved what could be saved, human lives." He never regretted it. Hitler wanted a Götterdämmerung. I chose to save my men, for their families, for Germany's future. Between honor and humanity, I chose humanity. His choices spared an estimated 250,000 soldiers and civilians from Soviet camps. Many survivors and their families still gather on May 8th to honor Wenck as the general who chose life over ideology. The mass German surrender in April-May 1945 was more than defeat. It was a humanitarian emergency, an ideological collapse, and proof that mercy can exist even at war's end. It changed the usual story. German forces didn't simply stop when ordered, they actively sought U.S. captivity as salvation. The disciplined Wehrmacht of 1940 ended as a desperate crowd in 1945, risking everything to avoid Soviet vengeance. For young American GIs who had fought across Europe, the shift was profound. Overnight, they became caretakers of the very men who had tried to kill them. Handling the crisis despite crazy numbers and logistics showed American organization and basic decency. Historian John Keegan later wrote that the German flight to American lines had no precedent. Never before had so many chosen a specific captor while still able to resist. It proved that in total war, calculations about mercy can outweigh ideology and orders. The last man to cross at Tangermünde was Heinrich Fischer, 63, a Volkssturm member. He reached U.S. lines at 4 to 7 on May 8th, 14 minutes before the ceasefire. Asked why he risked everything, he said, "I wanted to see my grandchildren." He did. Millions who missed the crossing did not. Private First Class Joseph Martinez, who processed POWs, summed it up. "They weren't really surrendering to us. They were running from something worse. We just meant survival. Any of us might have done the same." The desperate flight to U.S. lines in 1945 laid bare some hard truths about war and about people. In the end, survival could hinge on a simple fact: which uniform you handed your weapon to. For hundreds of thousands of Germans in April and May, that choice meant life or death. It wasn't about comfort or leniency, it was about odds. The numbers were stark. Those who surrendered to Western forces had a survival rate around 96.4%. Those taken by the Soviets, fewer than 65% ever made it home. Behind those percentages sat families altered forever, losses and reunions that would echo for decades. There was a deeper lesson, too. The American response, feeding enemies, treating wounds, maintaining order under crushing strain, showed that even after total war, duty and decency could win out over revenge. Young GIs who had just survived the Ardennes and the Ruhr now spent their nights saving the men who had tried to kill them. Organization mattered. So did humanity. The broken crossing at Tangermünde became more than scrap metal over the Elbe. It turned into a literal passage from one fate to another, from retribution to restraint, from one vision of victory to a different one. Those who reached the West Bank before May 8th mostly lived to rebuild homes and lives. Those who didn't often faced years in Soviet camps, if they endured at all. There was also a bitter irony in the way the war ended. The Wehrmacht that had marched east for Lebensraum finished the war fleeing west as refugees. A regime that boasted of a 1,000-year Reich lasted 12. Its soldiers ended up racing to surrender to the decadent democracies they once mocked. Historians still argue the ethics. Did accepting these surrenders save lives or break Allied unity? Did shielding German troops from Soviet custody undercut justice or serve it? The debate goes on. The human impact does not. Mercy at the end of the war shaped what followed. It softened memories, opened channels, and set conditions for the West German state that would emerge. That memory helped put Germany on a different path, into NATO, into a democratic order, into a partnership with the very army that had processed its surrender. Choices on riverbanks in May 1945 influenced alliances in the Cold War that followed. By 23:01 hours on May 8th, the shooting stopped. In the final 3 weeks alone, U.S. forces had taken in roughly 1.5 million German troops. The 102nd Infantry Division processed 313,000 by itself, more than the German army that crossed into Poland in 1939. 9th Army reported 423,000 from April 20th to VE Day. 1st Army, 387,000 learned. Fewer than 20,000 were seized in battle. The rest walked in under their own power. And even after the ceasefire, the tide kept flowing. Between May 8th and May 31st, another $874,000 reached Western lines from Soviet zones by slipping through, by clerical accidents, by guards reading the rules with compassion. Statistics told the size. Personal accounts told the meaning. Bread without sawdust, a cigarette from a guard, a doctor who said, "The war's over, now you're a patient." The bridge at Tangermünde, where so many stepped from one future into another, was never rebuilt. But the story of that crossing endures. It argues that victory can be measured in lives preserved, not just enemies destroyed. It says that mercy can count for more than vengeance when the killing stops. That is the final lesson of the flight to the American lines in 1945. Even at the end of the worst war in human history, people could choose life over hate. For those who crossed the Elbe in those last days, that choice made all the difference. Their journey was more than escape. It was a passage from the old world of racial war into a new world that tried to build on law and dignity. The fact that so many risked everything to reach the Americans was not only a military event, it was proof that mercy, shown at the right moment, can change the fate of nations. The story closes where it began, at a broken span over the Elbe, where enemies became prisoners, and where American soldiers, in accepting surrender, affirmed a basic truth about what victory could mean. In that hour, the choice between punishment and restraint shaped not only individual lives, but Europe's future, and how history would judge the end of the war.